All right, Mike, let's go ahead and get started. Want to say thanks to everybody who's made some time to be with us today. This is really kind of our second Stir, Shake, and Update webinar. We've got two more in front of us, and I'm excited to be joined today by Mike Tyndall, our chief architect and one of our co-founders. Mike, thanks for being here.
Hello, how's it going?
It's going very well, very well. And I have to say, very smoothly since the Stir, Shake, and deadline has come and gone, which is why we're here to talk today, which is great. Again, I see that the room is filling up. Everybody, please make sure to use the chat box if you have any specific questions along the way. I'll be monitoring that. We love to make this interactive, so feel free to add your thoughts and questions as we start going through the material. And I really like the topic of today's conversation. We're going to try to keep this to about 20 minutes. Really is Stir Shaken is live. It's here, and what you can expect going forward. So we're going to quickly get you guys caught up on what's happened in the last few weeks, and then what's going to be going on in the next few, leading up to our next series of our two other webinars about Stir Shaken coming up. And this is the way, by the way, you can get to those. If you just head over to our blog, go over to thinQ-teli and go over to the blog, you'll see a post there, and there are links to register for those events as well. So the next one coming up on the 1st will be all about attestation. What does it mean? How does it work? And that'll be coming up on the 1st. And then the 15th is, phase 2. Now that it's here, it's been rolled out. We'll cover the basics of what's already happened today, and then talk about what's coming down the road and how we see everything coming together. And happy to share that with you. So again, I'll put this up at the screen at the end of the session as well. So feel free to register for those as well. So real quick recap is, really, the reason that we're all on the phone today is because of the steps that the FCC has taken to really deal with spoofed caller IDs, which people sort of conflate with robocalling, illegal robocalling, I should say, as well. So we know that the FCC, they're getting lots and lots of spam complaints every single year, and it's in the many millions of these complaints. And again, they're saying that a large percentage of calls that are being made these days, tend to be spoofed caller IDs or sort of nuisance calls that I know we all want to find a way to deal with. A lot of folks have unfortunately gotten swindled over the course of these calls to give up their hard-earned money. You can see here, almost 20 billion lost to phone scams in 2020 alone. And I think, Mike, the really important stat here is that 80% of spam calls are using local area codes. They're basically forging their caller ID to make it look like it's a local call when in fact it's not, right?
Yeah, and I think that's pretty effective for the average person who's not in our industry and doesn't understand how easy it is to manipulate the outbound caller ID. So, for those of us, me specifically, anytime I see that, it's an instant red flag. But you also have to understand that's not necessarily the case,
right,
for everybody's grandma or somebody who's just not
right,
read into the industry and how it works. They're just used to using a phone.
That's right. That's right. And now with so much technology in play between the source of a call and where it ends up, in our hands, there's so many different ways to manipulate it. And as you mentioned, spoof caller IDs, that's not necessarily a difficult thing to do, which can lead to these misunderstandings. And then, of course, the FCC having to act with this new technology to help us, put our hands around it. And as you can see here, that the feds are taking it more seriously. They have doled out, a fair amount of penalties to some unsavory actors. And, for those of us who are in the industry, it's all too clear. We do get subpoenas asking us for information about calls that are made across different networks. And, we respond to those and try to keep things as clean as we can. But again, Stir Shaken is really here to help deal with the problem, ideally at the root level. And we'll talk more about where we are today and its efficacy. And again, Mike, when we were preparing for the webinar, really said it well, is that, this really is about, how can we use technology to mitigate, eliminate caller ID spoofing? So, really, a lot of these illegal calls, are coming through with, that forged caller ID information. It's a lot of cases, it's inaccurate. I get sales calls. I probably get 18 to 20 sales calls a day to my iPhone. And I can, and I can tell all the ones that are basically fake. And we'll look at that in just a minute of how that looks today versus, even just a year ago, how much better it's gotten. But it's all about, improving the accuracy of caller ID and enable voice providers to offer helpful information to users about when to answer is really the goal, right? So if we can get better information before we even pick up the phone, if the call, is from a trusted source, and the caller ID is correct, that'll go a long way so we can start trusting our phones again, because I don't think any of us trust our phones very well today, unless we have a good contact list and we keep that up to date and are allowing those calls to flow. So, Mike, with that, let's go ahead and get into this a little bit. And I think most people understand. We've got this stir and this shaken technology. Really, it's this framework of interconnected standards that's really designed to combat spoofed caller ID. And June 30th was really the first deadline for when stir shaken basically took effect in a way. Can you walk us through, Mike? What did happen on the 30th, and kind of what led up to that? What are the steps that had to be completed by then?
Yeah, so like we talked about in our last meeting on this topic, that was the deadline to go ahead and begin signing and passing identity headers with new calls. When we gave that update, we had a short list of vendors. The list has grown in the last several weeks of networks that support it. And we indicated that we were going to start signing those calls for networks that had passed interop and had gone through our stringent testing process for testing all kinds of things from header sizes to you have to manipulate caller ID to test it, right? So we did a bunch of manipulations. We ran through a whole bunch of things. So we now have a very templated onboarding process for this, because a lot of times they'll set up new trunk groups and you have to sort of test those in parallel and do a hot cut. Other cases, you get a notice that just says, hey, it's magically on. We coordinate those so that they don't just turn it on without having gone through the testing process. But we've got that pretty well nailed down now. And the calls are being signed if we don't get an identity header from the originating party.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And we were talking about too, one of the first ways that even me as a consumer that I see stir shaken working. One of the visual representations of that is this is actually a screen grab right off my iPhone. You see these check marks, right?
Yeah, we were talking about that yesterday. I noticed this a couple of weeks ago on mine, and I think on Android it's like a green check or something. I have Apple, but I was remarking because if I look at my contact list, I'll have the standard list of people that I talk to all the time. My wife being one of them, and I noticed that on some of the calls within the same day, I would have a little gray check mark like you're illustrating here on her contact, and then an hour, 2 hours later, same call, no check mark. So I was sort of scratching my head. I've talked to a few people about this, and I think what we're starting to see is the start of validation. And I don't think it's happening in every single case, which would explain why sometimes I see the checkbox, sometimes I don't.
Yep.
But we're starting to see, I think, probably some A/B testing going on PSTN and other phone networks with the actual validation piece. So once we sign it, whoever it lands on has to unpack that and decode it, look at the attestation, and decide what they're going to do. In this case, it looks like they've implemented this check system, right?
Right.
Other cases, it may manipulate the caller ID name if they're not quite sure, like where you have a potential spam right there.
Yep.
And all the way to the extreme case of just flat out rejection.
That's right. Yeah, I'd loved opening up some of these calls lately and seeing calls with a check mark have been verified by the carrier. So the carrier is starting to pass that data forward, which is good. Give me a little bit more peace of mind, so I can trust my handset a little more.
Yeah. What's interesting in my case is we're both T-Mobile, so it's and on the same account. So it's really weird to me how I can have somebody who's on my account with the same vendor who's calling my number multiple times, and I get mixed results.
Yep.
With this.
Yeah, me too. In fact, here, if you look back here, that's my wife right there. She has a checkbox, but not every single time. Right. So it's still a little spotty, and that's kind of the way the state of things. So just to sort of run down how the implementation has been going across the industry. Obviously, that deadline has passed. Basically where you are in the ecosystem sort of dictates the steps that you've had to take. The good news is, if you're a Think or a Tele voice customers, we've got you covered. We started that implementation, and we'll show you a couple of screenshots of how it's going in terms of how, as Mike mentioned, how we're vetting the carriers and letting you know which ones are supporting it so far and which ones aren't. Mm-hmm. And that is true. And one of the questions, I got a couple of questions before the webinar from registrants asking about, well, doesn't this really not even matter for another 2 years because a lot of the big carriers have gotten extensions. I don't think that's the right way to think of it, right, Mike? Like it's some people are going to get extensions, but overall, I mean, it's here and it's being implemented.
It's like an analogy I like to use. Actually, that's a lie. I just made this up. But the one that just popped in my head was, okay, I remember when the lockdown started a year ago and I'm driving down 540, which is this 4-lane loop around Raleigh. There's nobody there and everybody's speeding.
Yep.
Still illegal, but nobody's stopping you, right? It's kind of the same thing. It's like, Does it matter? Well, yeah, I guess if you get caught, it matters.
Yes. That's well said, actually. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. That's
yes.
Right.
So we take the approach of, hey, look, we know what we're supposed to be doing. So we're just going to go ahead and operate from, a good faith, best practices. We're going to do everything we can to adhere to this thing as soon as quickly as possible. As things change or they add things, we'll respond quickly. But again, I guess it comes back to the speeding analogy and if you get caught or not.
Right. For sure. Nobody wants to get caught, although some people certainly
have. It's expensive.
Yes, it is. It's getting a lot more expensive.
Yep.
So you mentioned, obviously, we've gone through the regulatory steps. The calls that you send through thinQ-teli are covered. And you mentioned, too, about how you were vetting the different carriers. So you can see here on the right-hand side, guys, if you logged into our platform right now, it's these check marks next to the carriers that represent that we've done that testing.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a been verified, like you would see on a social media platform sort of check mark. That means that the calls that go across that network will be either signed by us or preserved. Identity headers will be preserved by us for calls going across those networks. Right.
And you mentioned too, just beyond the fact that, so now we know who support it. We're currently doing B level attestation for the calls originating on our network, right? So
if it's coming from an account, which they all are accounts of ours, we can partially attest that we know who the customer is, and that's why we do that. Right. Things that don't look like numbers, international annies, we don't attest to.
Gotcha. And lastly, if we do have some customers that are actually signing their own calls, and we actually are passing that through, right?
Yeah, I've had several very good conversations with customers that are implementing their own stir shaking process. They've gone through all the regulatory steps, and we've really just sort of been having, water cooler conversations, comparing notes, and a lot of people have the same notes. We talk about areas of opportunity and concern, and what's going to happen if this happens, and there's a lot of those discussions going on, and it's good to hear that a lot of people are thinking about it in the same way. It just sort of validates what we're doing. But yeah, we definitely have, I'd say, at least half a dozen or so that are signing legitimately on their own.
Got it. And we just got a question from one of the listeners who said, we're not signing our calls. But if we send a call to you that is showing a CLID from another carrier, do you sign it as a B?
Yeah, right now, this is the phase one that we talked about in our earlier webinar a little over a month ago. We launched with B. We're not doing anything beyond that in terms of an A level or anything like that yet. That's coming end of this quarter with telephone inventory that's on our network, and that's on your account and coming from a trunk group or an IP address that's on your account. And we'll talk. We have a future webinar coming up. The next one, I believe, September 1.
Yep.
Where we go through all of the details around attestation. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself on that. That's going to be a really good one. We're just going to focus on attestation. So we're kind of giving a state of the union now in terms of here's where we were pre June 30. Here's what's happened since then. And then we're going to be doing a series of these short, more digestible discussions to really get into detail on different topics.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, as you just mentioned, so Q3, potentially doing, well, we will be doing the A-level attestation if it's a think assigned number.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, gotcha. And we'll get into more detail with that on the first as well. Yeah, and you'll notice too that this is even more carriers that we've been putting check marks next to. You'll see more and more of those show up in the platform. So that'll, give you a good indicator of, who's adhering to these in the early days and who is rolling it out over time. But in the meantime, as long as as long as you're using one of our numbers, it's on our network and, it's traversing, our solution, you're covered with the B-level attestation and everything is flowing, normally. We're not seeing any issues at this point. But I think it's important, Mike, to talk about the State of the Union in terms of sort of issues, with delays, right? So I mentioned early on that, some of the biggest carriers have asked for, a 2, in some cases almost a 3 or more than a 3-year extension to implementation. I think that has a lot to do with, Mike, we talked about this way back, was, a lot of these folks, these larger carriers have, sort of physical hardware that is not linked, to the cloud. So it's not being able to sign those calls is a whole different. It's basically impossible, right? Because it's traversing hardware.
They have massive networks. They have a lot of touch points that have to be updated, that have to be compliant. They have massive human resource organizations and engineers and all of these things that have to get coordinated. They're almost exclusively governed by process. I've worked in some of these companies. There's a process for everything. It's not like, on the nimble software side of things where we're able to be really quick and pivot really easily. They don't turn as quickly.
Right.
And they have a whole room full of regulatory lawyers that are, very binary with, we're not compliant because, we haven't done this little area of the network or all these things. So I think that's a totally appropriate request from their end, so that they're not violating anything. And I think that you'll see different segments of their network support it, kind of in a waterfall type approach where it's like the newer sections of the network that are more software based that are easily upgraded will probably support it first, and then they have to deal with the remnants of the PSTN, which is still quite large. So,
Gotcha. Yeah, so we're not. This is going to continue to be implemented over a long period of time. But the good news is that folks like us here at Think, we've got you covered. We're doing the right things. We're following the processes. We filed the proper protocols of how we're adhering to the new rules. Those have been filed with the database on the FCC website. And we'll continue to communicate with all of you about how the carriers are coming online and the different things that potentially might impact you. But the good news is obviously there's no change necessary on your side. If you want to come into the platform, go into the carrier list and take a look. You can see which ones are up to speed and which ones aren't. But it's not going to impact your call flow, right, at this point. So it's it's just good to know you're with a company like us that we've been paying attention to the rules, we're following them, and they've been properly implemented. So you guys can rest easy with good peace of mind. So with that, Mike, I'd say look at that, 18 minutes. I said 20 minutes or less. That's perfect. So would love to have everybody back to have a larger discussion about attestation. And I think some people still might have questions about what is it, what do each of the levels mean? Why would you assign a call an A or B or a C, and how might that impact my calls getting through or not getting through? So we'll go in depth into that on the 1st, and then you look even farther out on the 15th with, hey, what's phase 2 looking like, and what now coming up on the 15th.
Exactly.
So with that, I'd love to open it up. If anybody had any additional questions, I think we already answered Carlos's question. Curious if anybody's seen any impact on their calls. They shouldn't have in the short term here that it's been live, or if anybody has any other questions. Mike, you were going to say?
Yeah, no, I've had several conversations with clients that use different networks, some with and without the check mark. And we're definitely starting to see validation starting to happen, especially on the unsigned calls. I was A/B testing some stuff with a customer last week, and they have basically every vendor selected, and some of the calls they were getting on brand new numbers, just scam likely sort of indicators on the far end. So we were trying to figure out what was going on there. It turns out that validation was happening and there was no identity header because it was not on a network that supported it or said they would support it. So we had to hone down their vendor list to make that work for them.
Interesting. Well, speaking of that, we got another question here. Is talking about how, this partner of ours has a longtime customer who makes legit and legal market research calls, and it says that those are being made on behalf of a specific company to their existing clients, and others are, random calls and legal research calls. But he's saying for a while now they've been rotating CLIDs, which all originate back to them and are legally owned because they tend to get marked as spam or scam likely on cell phones. So any thoughts about why that might be happening?
Okay. Because nobody wants those research calls. I mean, what they do is it's a process that has been in use for a while, which is number rotation. Because what happens is the reputation of a number gets burned, and then it gets flagged in a reputation type of database, which is part of robocall, caller ID manipulation mitigation. It's several issues all kind of conflated and jammed together into this one issue we call robocalls. Robocalls is just the machines making the calls. That's one thing. Another thing is caller ID manipulation. That's, manipulating caller ID to enhance or with the intention of improving complete rate for whatever reason that is. Most of the time it's because the number's been flagged or reported to some sort of third-party service that supplies a reputation score on a number, and it's no good anymore. We call that burning numbers. Carriers don't like that.
Right.
There's a limited pool of possible digits that can be issued, and they don't want large tranches of their inventory tainted.
Right.
I don't. That is the answer. But I get the impact to that particular customer's business. They want to do research. I think where that's probably going to end up as they continue to regulate is, okay, well, then just like with text messaging, you have to have an opt-in and opt-out process if you're going to be a campaign, almost like a campaign registry, like we have to do with SMS.
That's right.
So.
Gotcha. All right. Well, great, Mike. I appreciate the background. It's good to know. We've got everything up and running. There's more details to come on attestation and sort of phase 2 of the Stir Shake and rollout. And so far, smooth sailing. It's great to see additional check marks showing up on our platform, showing other carriers that are supporting it as we go forward over these last few weeks and into the coming weeks. So we'd love for everybody to sign up for the next couple webinars. We'll continue to communicate what's going on. And again, happy to take your questions in the meantime. But Mike, appreciate you taking a part of your day. I know you've been super busy lately, not only with the Stir Shake and rollout. Yeah. Not only that is very true. Not only with the Stir Shake and rollout, but also a lot of other neat things coming from us at thinQ-teli. And I was going to say, by the way, stay tuned for that. In the next couple of weeks, you're going to be hearing some pretty interesting news coming from us in an exciting way. I'm just going to tempt you with that little tidbit, but watch your inboxes, and we'll be communicating about some really cool things coming from us coming up into September, and some new capabilities and some new things that are really taking us to the next level. So we're excited and say thank you to all of our current customers out there. Thank you for your business. If you're not a customer and you'd like to make sure your calls are getting handled correctly and being signed and Stir Shake and compliant, definitely reach out to us. Always we're open to just have a discussion with you about what your needs are. How can we make a custom voice and or messaging solution to meet your platform or your service provider's needs, and be happy to take that call. Hey, Mark just snuck one in here. Mike, let me see. So Mark is asking, our clients forward their calls to us when they want us to handle their incoming customer service calls. We are currently receiving the original caller's caller ID. Will Stir Shake and eventually prevent their carrier from sending the caller ID on a forwarded call? That's a good question.
I think that ultimately is going to determine which attestation bucket it lands in. Um,
Hmm.
we talked about this a lot on the last one. That, like, technically, you can still do what you want with those headers. What's going to happen to it, I think, is in the short term going to be sort of variable until this shakes out. Sometimes there's no issue. Sometimes you see like weird, caller ID name manipulations where it says spam likely, things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Then we've got another event tomorrow, right?
Yes, yes. We thank you, Mike. Appreciate that reminder. My mind is in 7 places. Yeah, we're actually we're recording a podcast. Mike is also talking about stir shaken issues with our friends over at Telecom Reseller. So we'll be sending out an email along with a recording of this webinar, but also we'll link you over to the Telecom Reseller site so you can tune in to hear Mike continue to talk about stir shaken and other things that are going on. Thanks for that reminder. You're right.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, lots of different ways to get the word out. So hey, appreciate. Wow, we had quite a turnout today, Mike. I think it's time well spent, and we'll continue to communicate about this, as I said, as we go forward. So have a great rest of your day, my friend, and we'll talk to everybody else really soon. Thank you for
Great.
tuning in.
Have a good one. Thanks.
All right, guys.